Teaching our children well. How do we develop the skills for a 21st century economy? No one argues this is where our economic future starts, but there's a fierce debate about how we upgrade our education system to turn these pupils into successful citizens. Good evening, I'm Sean Plunket. Education, the class size versus teacher quality debate. It divides the main parties. And today, John Key's been on the campaign trail, selling the government's controversial investing in educational success policies, after primary teachers gave them a resounding thumbs down yesterday.
Well, I believe we do have the support of a lot of teachers. Even within the teachers that the NZEI represents, there are many schools and many teachers that would actually support what we're doing.
Joining me tonight is the Minister of Education and author of the proposed reforms, Hekia Parata. Labour's education spokesman Chris Hitkins is here, and we have two experts from the New Zealand Initiative, a former teacher and supporter of much of the government's proposals, Rose Patterson, and a critic, Martin Thrupp, who is Professor of Educational Research at the University of Waikato. Hekia Parata, you've gambled $359 million over 4 years that incentivising teachers is the way to improve our education system. Why are you so convinced that that is the way to go?
Well, that's one part of the initiative. At the heart of this actually is how do we make sure that we get better education for children and young people all the way along their pathway from early childhood through primary to secondary and on to tertiary. It's about how parents are involved in identifying what the common challenges are along that pathway, and then it's about ensuring that how teachers and principals get coaching, mentoring and support in order to consistently raise expert practice across the system.
And that means paying the good teachers, or those you identify as good, more?
It means providing meritorious allowances to recognise the experience of these teachers, which will be selected based on standards that the profession have been involved in writing and on a process of appointment that the sector will be involved in.
Chris Hitkins, you say that is the wrong approach. What's your alternative?
Well, I just want to be clear here. It's not either class sizes or teacher quality. It's actually both. So I think you framed it wrong at the beginning. We want to increase teacher quality as well. Lowering class sizes will have an impact on teacher quality. It gives teachers more one-to-one time with each student. Any teacher will tell you that. And many of the things that research tell us have an impact on student achievement are in themselves affected by class size.
So you say you're aiming for the same goal, but you're going to get there in a different way.
Absolutely. We want to increase student achievement and improve teacher quality. Absolutely.
I want to come to you, Rose. Who do you think is right?
That's a very difficult question. I mean, we think that the Investing in Education Success policy is a long-term proposal. So class size is very immediate. You can see why teachers want that, because they know that it's concrete, it's immediate. Next year they can have smaller class sizes for their children under this policy. Whereas the IES policy is about long-term building up that teacher capacity. So we would be in favour of the longer-term approach.
Well, what's needed most to your mind, Martin? The short-term fix, as Rose has typified it, or a longer-term policy? And which of these two approaches is more efficacious?
I'm all for the class sizes side of it. I think that the policy, the IES policy itself, is the problem, and this is why you're seeing the primary teachers taking this step. I admire them. They're effectively trying to protect schools from other bad policies being driven into them. What
is wrong with paying good teachers or teachers who upskill more?
There are a number of issues. One is that the motivation of teachers is not pressed directly by this. They're often motivated by much more altruistic things. But really, it's not about, I mean, I call it investing in educational control, is what I call the policy, because really it's about steering the education system, making up openings that allow other types of policies to come in behind this policy.
So you have philosophical fears about this policy?
Oh, and very practical ones as well, like the disruption in schools, like the fact that the money should be used in other areas, like for teachers, support staff. Special needs is crying out for more money.
But what do you mean disruption? Because we already fund 4.5 million hours of release time in our schools now. Every year, teachers and principals are out of class. They are involved in professional collaborations. They're having professional learning and development. They're on sabbaticals. They are out now. What we're trying to provide is a more systematic, less ad hoc approach that is built around the children and young people's needs.
Well,
and as for class sizes...
Would you agree, though, Heki Parata, this is fundamentally an ideological argument?
Well, it's not ideological on my part. What we've done is looked at the research both here in New Zealand and overseas. We've also looked at what the characteristics are of the systems with whom we compete for to ensure our young people are up there with them. And this argument about class size, first of all, the policy is actually about one less child in a class over 4 years. And actually, if you look at the funding formula now, the average at secondary school is 1 to 21, when Labour's talking about getting to 1 to 23, and at primary school the average is 1 to 23, and Labour's talking about getting to 1 to 26.
Those are absolute nonsense figures that the minister has just
come
up with.
They are funding formula.
They're simply not true. The funding formula for secondary schools at the moment is 1 to 26.
And that is not.
That is absolutely true. The maximum average class size in the largest schools, the funding formula is 1 to 26, and in primary schools, those primary schools that we want to target, the classes, the funding formula is 1 to 29, and we want to lower that to 1 to 26.
For year
that is what the Ministry of Education fund on. I'm happy to print the document off the Ministry's website.
I'm happy to print it too. Because what the funding over 13 years reflects is where there's deemed to be the most intensive need for teacher-student interaction. So for year 1, for instance, the funding formula is 1 to 15. For years 12 and 13, where NCA 2 and NCA 3 are occurring, they're 1 to 17.
I want to come back to something that Martin says. Rose, you've been a teacher. Did you do it purely for the love, or would more money have made a difference to the amount of time you spent, or whether or not you stayed indeed in the job?
Well, first of all, I was a teacher in Japan, so it was a completely different context. But, I mean, if I can give a personal anecdote, my mum was a teacher. She was a primary school teacher, and so she started teaching in the 1970s. And back then, it was one of the only options for bright, motivated people who wanted a rewarding career, who wanted to make a difference. It was sort of teaching or nursing or, you know, admin work for women in particular. Nowadays, young people coming out of university have so many more options available to them, where they've got career, you know, paths ahead of them. At the moment, the teacher salary scale it ends at 8 years. So we think that the IES has the potential to break through that glass ceiling and allow young people who aren't currently teachers but who might otherwise go into the profession to see, actually, there is a career there for me.
That's quite a compelling argument, Martin.
Well, no, I see the government really fiddling while Rome burns here. I think there are much more better ways for improving teacher performance. And one of them, for example, is exactly that the issue that Labor is doing with advisory services. What's happened there, Sean, is they've effectively been contracted out, and so the people in those areas don't have any certainty from year to year. So it's a very thin kind of provision, and that's the issue.
I want to, if I can, find some consensus here. Do we all agree that the most urgent need for an improvement in education outcomes is in lower decile schools in places like South Auckland? Can we all say yes, we agree with that?
It's not that simple, because you have to connect it to the population as a whole. And, for example, we have considerable segregation between our schools and the intakes that they involve, and so policies also involve the middle class as well as...
If I could say something about lower decile schools, the New Zealand initiative, we've just been doing a bit of research on class sizes across the deciles, and what we find is that decile 10 schools actually have larger class sizes, so they have about 25 students per teacher, whereas decile 1 schools have around 21. And that's not actually a deliberate policy, it's just the way the funding formula is weighted towards smaller schools, which tend to be lower decile. But the class size issue, if it is effective, and the research is a little bit shaky on it, but where you do see an effect, you see it with students from disadvantaged backgrounds. So the system is actually kind of working already.
And you say it's delivering the policy that Labor's promising already, in effect.
Well, in a way, but it's, you know, the Labor policy is quite blunt. It's across the system, whereas at the moment you are actually having smaller class sizes in those lower decile schools.
And it isn't either or, because actually in the last 5 years since we've been in government, teacher numbers have gone up by 15%, while student numbers have gone up by 0.7%. So it isn't either teacher numbers or quality of teaching practice, it's how we do both.
Well, it's really because you're going to axe this policy if you get into government.
I don't know where those numbers came from, because actually student numbers have according to Ministry of Education roll returns, student numbers have slightly declined and teacher numbers have slightly declined over the time that Heki is talking about. So I'm not sure where she's picked up those numbers from. But I think the really important thing that we've got to talk about here is student progress. And actually, when it comes to low decile schools, they can be making enormous progress with those kids. And yet those kids, because of the way the government are measuring and targeting things, they're still deemed to be failing. But they can make far more progress actually in some low decile schools than some of the higher decile kids who aren't making much progress.
What we've just heard from the initiative is those schools already have the low class sizes that you were promising.
And moreover, if that is the case, Chris, then you should be supporting the delivery into schools in Term 4 this year, the progress and consistency tool, which does provide for capturing exactly the progress that is being made.
Again, it doesn't deal with progress. The national standards, which is what PACT is based on, are based on a stocktake of whether a kid jumps a particular hurdle at a particular time.
No,
it's not based on the progress that they make, because kids can make an enormous amount of progress in a year and still be below standard.
Okay. Well,
national
that is
standards
true.
puts a label on them and says
Martin, I want to come back to you. I guess in many ways there is a faith that teachers know what is best for us. We're all brought up to believe that. And we have, it would seem to me, a split amongst the teachers. We've got primary teachers who say they don't like it, and we seem to have qualified support, don't we, from secondary school teachers and principals.
It would be very interesting if it got put out to the teachers in the same way as with the primary teachers,
yes,
whether there would be their level of support. I want to come back to national standards, because really it's a very damaging policy that is narrowing the curriculum, it's labelling children. If I could see the person that came up with the labels below and well below, I would take off my shoes and throw it at them right here.
Well, thanks for all that emotiveness, but actually they're not labels. What's required at a system level, what we now know from 0 to 18-year-olds is how many kids are participating in early childhood education. At what years in primary school we have particular challenges. It is too late to wait till year 9 to discover that a child cannot read or write or do maths at the level they need to. And so all the way through the system we are seeing progress. Let's go to progress. When you went out of government, Māori kids were leaving school at 44% of them had NCEA 2. That's shameful. Absolutely. And here we are 5 years on, it's now 63%. That's a nearly 20% improvement in 5 years. It's still not good enough,
those kids
but
were
it's
primary
better.
School when
Here's a very good example.
Those kids were primary
well, if you want to talk about the 15-year-olds and data is one of the characteristics of best performing systems.
I want to move on from this somewhat binary argument, clearly. I want to ask, is there any other area in education, and Martin, I think you're the best placed person to say this, where we're currently failing or we need to take some new initiatives? And I'm thinking in particular of what we are teaching our children and what sort of careers we are preparing them for.
Sean, if I look at the policies of the key government over 2 terms now, I think we're seeing a hollowing out of the education system, and I really struggle to point to improvements. The area that could possibly be looked at, I think, in that way is the modern school environments, but even there are problems, the IT problems. Generally, I think we've got a weakening of policy over the last 6 years.
Well, Professor Thrupp, given that you spend most of your time researching for the NZEI and you use a sample of 6 schools... No, I'm not. I'm just stating a fact. And the sample of your research is 6 schools. We're dealing with 2,500 schools.
Well, Minister, your government is extremely selective in the research that it pulls up from overseas. Extremely selective in the academics that it chooses to
Martin, thank you.
to. And,
Heki, I want to come back to you and say one thing we haven't discussed tonight and hasn't made headlines much are charter schools. With the apparent, well, I don't know, weakening in support for the ACT Party, are charter schools still an important part of National's education platform or not?
So New Zealand, one of the reasons why we're seen as being a top-performing education system, and we are, is the diversity of schooling options that are available for parents. So whether that's single-sex or co-ed, total immersion Māori or English, faith-based or secular, we have those options. And what we've known for some time is that while many of our kids are successful, those that are not so successful, too many of them are Māori, are Pacific, come from poorer homes.
So charter schools are still there? Are you still into them?
So they are one option that is still there. No one is compelled to send their children to them. And almost 3/4 of the kids who are there are ones who've been excluded.
Does the charter schools survive under a Labor administration?
No, they don't. And it's interesting, isn't it, that the charter schools are using smaller class sizes as one of their marketing
that's the
tools.
choice one school's
they're absolutely using smaller
that's
class
one
sizes,
choice
as
one
do
school
private
is
schools.
making.
So if class sizes don't matter, I look forward to the private schools all putting up
We didn't
signs
say
saying that they're going to have bigger class
sizes. We said
sizes.
they have less effect for the amount of money involved.
There's plenty of diversity within the state system anyway.
Rose, do you think charter schools have proven themselves or not?
It's too early to tell, and charter schools is a very marginal policy. It's a tiny number of schools.
Right.
And, what we really should be talking about is the public education system and the improvements that we can make there.
Right. Exactly, that's exactly what we should be doing.
So we don't need the distraction of charter schools when we should be focused on
Chris, it's
improving
you that
outcomes
keeps bringing it up as a distraction.
Well, when you're giving charter schools up to 5 times the funding of state schools, I think that that's wrong. I think that money should be going into targeting student achievement in all schools.
And also, ACT is clearly very interested in having more charter schools, so we have to look at coalition partners and so on.
Well, we may, I think, have talked ourselves to a standstill here. It is clear from this discussion that this is a part of policy on this election where the battle lines are very, very clearly drawn. I thank you all for joining us to discuss this, and I think we all behaved relatively wisely during that, didn't we? All right. After the break, we'll just have our politicians with us, and we are going to discuss the events of another torrid week on the campaign trail. Back soon.